I am sorry to interrupt your Christmas festivities, merries, celebration time with your families, your loved ones, because Africa is about celebration. So you deserved it. 2025 was a long year. But I have a very good reason why this is an important time for me to speak to you. Because 2025 has been one of the most remarkable years across Africa in terms of humanitarian issues and human rights conversations. I do not want to take most of your time, but I think it's important you understand what happened across Africa. My name is Alex Ayub. I'm a humanitarian practitioner and a human rights lawyer. I've spent the last 10 years working across the intersection between humanitarian issues and human rights. And this is exactly why I want to be able to speak to you about humanitarian affairs in Africa. If you didn't know, one of the main concerns for Africa today is the fact that every development that happens seems to be taken aback by, conflicts, disasters, cyclones, climate change issues, both natural and man-made disasters. This is exactly what has been happening across Africa in 2025. I want to bring to you the Humanitarian Affairs Africa podcast. This is basically a podcast that, amplifies African humanitarian voices from the grassroots, wherever all these things are happening, from where the communities are affected. Beyond that, it looks at the intersection of the legal development, policy issues that happened, whatever these leaders that we have in place decided to do with the powers that we have given them. And lastly, one of the most important things about the Humanitarian Affairs Africa podcast is we're able to look at a pathway. We want to forge a pathway towards meaningful impact, solutions, durable solutions for what we are facing in Africa. And this is exactly what the Humanitarian Affairs Africa podcast is about. My name is Alex Ayub, and please stay with me. So my work has really spanned across, I've physically been to West Africa, Togo, Ghana. I've come to the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. And of course to the South. I've been to South Africa. Beautiful place. And I have seen firsthand what humanitarian crisis looks like across some of these regions. And did you know, by the way, that the largest humanitarian crisis of 2025 happened not in Gaza, not in Ukraine? The largest humanitarian crisis in Africa happened in Sudan, right here in Africa. Did you even know that? Now, this particular year in 2025, we are talking about 33.7 million people who are affected by the conflict that's been happening in Sudan. You will be interested to know that the conflict in Sudan is not about any outsider. And rightfully so, because in Africa we say that if there is no enemy within, the enemy without can do us no harm. The conflict in Sudan is basically a situation between two fighting opposing forces, the RSF and the Sudanese army. This conflict has been going on for, not just this year. It started before this year, and you can remember even at the time when the former president Omar al-Bashir was vacating power. And this is the beginning of this particular conflict. We have had one of the worst humanitarian scenarios that happened in El Fasher in October of this year. On the 26th of October, the world woke up to very sad news. Thousands of people had been killed, blatantly killed by forces linked to the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. Now, when we talk about people, we are always tempted to just say, it's numbers. 33.7 million people are affected. But this situation is a bit different. Do you remember a video that was going rounds on social media of a mother trying to shield her own children from presumptuously people who were armed? And she tried to shield her children. In fact, stories has it, maybe you might need to confirm with me, that eventually she ended up getting killed with her children in El Fasher. And this was exactly the scenario for most people who are living in Sudan for the better part of 2025. Now, women were raped. These are people's mothers. These are people's sisters. These are daughters, wives. These are people who both of us relate to. Children were killed. I mean, since when did we start killing children in Africa? Even traditionally, we had conflicts, between one community and the other. And at no particular time did we see children being killed. In fact, in many cases, they used to be absorbed by the winning community in that particular battle. But we are seeing a divergence from this. And that's exactly what we saw in Sudan, where children were being mutilated. And we are talking about even scenarios where even a decent send-off was not possible for their families because they were buried in mass graves. Now, normally when conflicts happen, then not everything stops. So schools were closed. And even to make it worse, hospitals were also attacked in Sudan. This 2025. And of course, with medical facilities, basically brought to their knees. And we are talking about homes destroyed. We are talking about schools closed. They even went ahead to destroy communication systems within Sudan to ensure then that whatever atrocities happened there were never communicated to the world. But we're living in a digital era, and lots of these clips are there on social media, basically talking about what happened in Sudan. So that is just a glimpse of what happened. And this did not just affect Sudan. We say that in Africa, Ubuntu, I am because you are. Now, we are having a situation whereby people flew from Sudan, crossed over to the neighboring country, Chad. And when this happens, of course, some went to Chad, some went downwards towards South Sudan. Some of them even moved from Chad, crossed over all the way to Cameroon. And when this happens, we are talking about mass displacements, refugee crisis. Of course, if you're a humanitarian like me, you know that what this brings, it basically brings scenarios where food insecurities come in, disease outbreaks, need for shelter, definitely. And of course, sometimes this even exacerbates situations in countries like Chad, who are already facing their own humanitarian crisis. So as we are thinking about that, this is very, very important that you do not forget Sudan to date is not having a good close of the year. They're still mourning their loved ones, and they're still in a dire humanitarian crisis in 2025. Now, from Sudan, we don't need to go far. We just need to go south and get to the most beautiful and the youngest country in the continent, South Sudan. Now, all of you would know that South Sudan recently, about 10 years ago, decided to break away from Sudan and become an independent state. And of course, they have not really stabilized, but they've made significant gains in relation to the politics and stability within that particular country. Although 2025 almost threatened that. Yeah. We are talking about a situation whereby, as the conflict was exacerbating in Sudan, their neighbor, we had a huge influx of over 1.3 million refugees who are seeking refuge and asylum in South Sudan. So this is the situation whereby, initially it was South Sudanese moving to neighboring countries like Kenya and Uganda seeking asylum. Now, this is a situation, and exactly this is Africa, where Sudan is fighting and South Sudan is the recipient of asylum seekers. Now, it's interesting to note that it's not just the refugee crisis that basically made South Sudan a point of interest for 2025 in terms of humanitarian issues. One of the main things that also happened is that South Sudan faced South Sudan faced one of the worst humanitarian crises around disease outbreak, specifically cholera. And this is basically in the context that, of course, we know that South Sudan is still young. They're still trying to build their own systems, structures, especially in the health systems. And so they had to mobilize resources rapidly to deal with this particular outbreak of cholera, which is actually it's reported is the worst in the history of South Sudan ever to actually be seen. This is not putting into context that 1.3 million people are coming from Sudan, and they're coming to also get help from South Sudan. Now, this is the humanitarian part of it. Politically, you realize that this is the same year that, this particular coalition government that was formed after their, at their secession from Sudan was also threatened with the breakout from power, basically. We had the president and the vice president, again, locking horns. Yeah, they locked horns. This is basically what happens in Africa. And we actually ended up having a situation whereby the vice president was even, arrested, and the story of what basically happened. Now, everybody was really brought to their feet, fearing that South Sudan could actually go back to conflict. So as we are also celebrating and thinking about, what else we did for 2025, remember that South Sudan, as we speak, is still facing fears of reemergence of conflict because of the serious political situation that's happening there right now. We're also having a situation whereby they're still just coming out of the disease outbreak. And this is not to mention that climate change is significantly affecting that particular country and the bigger horn of Africa, basically, in this relation. So that is one of the major things for you in South Sudan. Yeah. Now, we all know that one of the richest countries in the world in terms of mineral deposits is what? Exactly. You thought that right. The Democratic Republic of Congo. This particular conversation will not be complete if I do not talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo, for very specific reasons and interests that you and I will agree with me. Now, it basically goes like this. Democratic Republic of Congo has huge mineral deposits from gold, lithium, cobalt, a lot of the minerals basically that you and I both need to have, equipment like this, your phone that you're holding right now. A lot of that is basically coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And such basically sometimes attracts the eye, the neighbor's eye. Now, not the neighbor from Africa, the international neighbor. And they have seen this. Now, unfortunately, Democratic Republic of Congo literally witnessed one of the worst incursions in terms of military actions and armed conflicts, especially in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The areas of Bukavu, basically, is one of the areas that were really, really affected. And this is basically because of the M23 offensive. Some of you will know the origin of M23, which basically came in. We can all trace it back to this, the unfortunate incident of the Rwanda massacre, the Rwanda genocide that happened in 1994. Another moment when literally everybody forgot about Africa, and people really let down Rwanda. And so we are still experiencing the effects of that. And M23 basically, as a rebel group that emerged around that particular time, decided to make it for themselves. This is the time to take over Democratic Republic of Congo. And they started it in Bukavu, Kivu area in Eastern DRC. And they ended up displacing over 1 million people in early 2025. Now, this is one of the saddest things that I'm about to say. It's actually estimated that in every 30 minutes in early 2025, a child was raped. Yes, every 30 minutes, a child was raped in Eastern Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. And basically, for what? Some have already said, and you and I know the story, that there's a conversation around minerals. The president is trying to pull together a military that can be able to, just like many other countries in the world, just be able to protect their sovereignty and ensure that any armed conflict that is not sanctioned by the same government is, of course, just dealt with. But we have seen this particular situation not only affect the humanitarian situation, or rather not only exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in DRC Congo, but in the neighboring countries as well. In fact, Burundi witnessed massive movements of refugees coming from Democratic Republic of Congo into Burundi. And not just there, we also saw this massive movement moving into Uganda as well. And when we talk about this, I always want you to remember that at the heart of it is a mother who is supposed to carry her children, walk with them across rivers. This is one of the areas that has majority of the rivers, and they actually call the Great Lakes region of Africa. And they had to cross these in dangerous situations that you and I would not even want to imagine, to just try and get some safety and security and a life for their families. While doing that, majority of them faced one of the worst humanitarian atrocities that were committed, basically, and violation of human rights that were done by this the armed conflict, and of course the armed people, the M23 rebels. Now, as I mentioned, a child was raped, a mother was killed, a home was tortured, a school was destroyed, a health facility was literally brought down to its knees. Then you wonder, do we even have human life anymore? It's interesting that the Democratic Republic of Congo citizens are one of the most resilient populations I've come across in the entire world. And we are still seeing them waking up every day and wanting things to work. And I'll tell you briefly about what happened to try and bring this particular situation to a close. But please do not forget that people were killed and continue to be killed today as we speak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Africa, right here at the heart of Africa. Now, I have to talk about one of the countries that I personally visited, Ethiopia. I love that country. And one of the main reasons why I actually have a specific positive feeling towards Ethiopia is because Ethiopia is literally the heart of Africa, because it hosts the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Now, one of the most interesting things about Ethiopia this year is that one of the main things that happen in this region, basically, besides it being in the Horn of Africa, and of course, if I mention the Horn of Africa, definitely know that there is an issue around climate change. There's an issue around drought. But one of the human-made conflicts that happen in this particular region is in Amhara and Tigray regions, because we are actually talking about over 28.7 million people who are in serious humanitarian crisis and need a lot of aid because of these regional conflicts. Now, you will understand that at the heart of Africa, trying to solve and trying to be the hosting the African Union. And of course, African Union has been trying to find lasting solutions to some of the conflicts that you've already talked about. It's also struggling internally to deal with its own conflicts. And of course, in Tigray region, we saw mass displacements of people. In Amhara region, we saw mass displacement of populations. And of course, again, trying to seek better shelter, safer areas, moving into secure regions. But of course, this is just not to forget that as Ethiopia is facing this humanitarian crisis, there are a lot of other, pieces that are moving within the same country. And you and I both know that Ethiopia has actually played an instrumental role trying to bring, peace and stability in neighboring countries, for example, Somalia, and you've seen its efforts go beyond even Somalia before that. You've also seen it trying to mediate situations in South Sudan as well. And so it's actually unfortunate that the home of African Union, basically the one that hosts the aspirations of Africa. Did you know about the African Agenda 2063? Yes, that's the African Union aspirations, basically hosted within Ethiopia. But yet, Ethiopia continues to face this particular crisis. That was Ethiopia for you in 2025. Now, beyond the major humanitarian crises that I talked about, of course, the conflicts in Sudan, I've talked about South Sudan, we're talking about Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are actually some neglected, or some will use the word forgotten, humanitarian crises that happened across Africa. If you'd walk with me, you know that in early January 2025, Mozambique actually faced one of its worst, again, natural disasters, Cyclone Dikeledi. And Cyclone Dikeledi basically had a situation whereby over 15,000 homes were destroyed. And of course, this was, of course, putting Mozambique in a very bad position just at the beginning of 2025, in January. But later on in the year, an unfortunate incident happens where in the region called Cabo Delgado, we actually had humanitarian crisis where there were conflicts. And this conflict, not many people talk about it because, what is the space of Cabo Delgado when you're talking about Gaza, we're talking about Ukraine, you're talking about conflicts between, different powers of the world. But specifically in this particular situation, Cabo Delgado also witnessed a serious conflict situation where people were killed, and we actually have people being displaced, huge populations moving as well in Mozambique, specifically because of this conflict. It's one of the humanitarian crises that is important to keep an eye on even as we close on the year, because remember the cyclone that Cyclone Dikeledi happened in January of 2025, and it started in December of 2024. And we are literally in another 1 year anniversary of that. And we know how repetitive humanitarian crises become, especially natural disasters. And it's not out of the woods yet. So you might find a situation whereby Mozambique will be dealing with man-made conflicts, of course, man-made disasters like armed conflict, but at the same time, natural disasters like the cyclone Dikeledi that happened early this year. And that is important to remember, even as we think about the major crisis that defined 2025 in Africa. Now, this is exactly the point where I shift gears and try to paint for you the picture of what was happening in West Africa, and specifically in the Sahel region. You and I both know that Africa currently is witnessing one of the major, transforming moments in its geopolitics. We are seeing a lot of coup d'etats that are affecting governments, especially in West Africa. Now, in the Sahel region, specifically Burkina Faso and Mali, we actually saw insurgencies, jihadist insurgencies, insecurities happening within this particular region. And in Burkina Faso alone, 60,000 people were displaced in April of 2025. And this is basically attributed to, instability in the region. There's been change of governments. There are countries that literally came out of an election. And of course, there are, coup d'etats that are coming into place. Some will argue that they are doing good for their own population. Some will have a different feeling saying, why don't we allow democratic processes to continue? Whichever point you subscribe to, whichever area you want to get inclined to. The most important bit is that as all this comes into play, there are human beings, there are people from Burkinabe that were actually displaced because of conflicts. We actually have people in Mali who are displaced because of these particular conflicts and jihadist insurgencies. And of course, this has been affecting normal life and infrastructure within that particular country, from health facilities to homes being destroyed, to schools being tortured, to actual displacements of people, and just ripping apart the socioeconomic dynamics within the Sahel region. And of course, this is an interesting area to watch actually as we come to a close of 2025, because we are not yet done with what we are witnessing in West Africa. About 2 weeks ago, was it 3? There was actually a failed coup d'etat that happened in Benin. So we're going to keep a close eye. We are going to keep a close eye into this particular region, even as we close in 2025. Well, still setting camp in West Africa, I want us to specifically give a focus on one amazing country called Cameroon. Now, if you know the politics and the dynamics around Cameroon, you know that there is, of course, the French-speaking Cameroon and the English-speaking Cameroon. So, the Anglophone and Francophone part of Cameroon. And one of the most interesting situations is that Cameroon is one of the countries that was dealing with literally triple conflicts at the same time. three main crises were going on in Cameroon in 2025 at the same time. We had the Lake Chad Basin conflict that was happening. Then we also had, of course, the Southwest, Northwest separatists conflicts that were also happening within Cameroon this particular period. And we continue to monitor this situation because, remember, earlier on I mentioned that there were displacements that were coming from the eastern parts and the northern parts of Africa, all the way from Sudan into Chad, of course, and moving on. Now, we also had Cameroon receiving refugees from Central African Republic. And so beyond population from Cameroon already being destabilized by conflicts, we also had a situation where they were also receiving refugees and asylum seekers from the Central African Republic. So multiple disasters, multiple conflicts, and at the same time, a serious humanitarian crisis of receiving refugees and asylum seekers. And so this, of course, stretched the capacity of Cameroon to respond, and of course, stretched the capacity of even other people to just come in, other countries to come in and give aid to Cameroon. Now, just bringing this bad situation, well, we call it a bad situation because, I mean, how are these things happening in Africa, especially things that are caused by human beings? All the ones that I've talked about are basically armed conflict. But there are also other continental health and climate trends that were observed across Africa in 2025. For a start, in southern and eastern Africa, in countries like Angola, Malawi, Zimbabwe, we actually saw disease outbreaks coming in. For example, Mpox, there was Mpox outbreak, cholera, malaria as well. We still have malaria. And of course, we know a lot of people are talking about what efforts are being undertaken to eliminate malaria completely. But one of the things to note is that these were also humanitarian crises that affected, of course, like I mentioned, the southern and East African regions. And there were basically stretches that were happening in terms of their capacities to even deal with these particular scenarios. Not to forget, at the apex of the Horn of Africa, Somalia. Somalia is actually one of the countries that have experienced long-lasting conflicts for a very long time now. Some of us were literally born knowing that Somalia has always had conflicts. Now, it's interesting to note that in 2025, there was a 35% increase in the hunger index, food insecurity index, which is basically one of the highest for Somalia. And this is basically coupled with the fact that 2024 was recorded as the warmest year ever. And that means that affected food production, that of course meant that there was food insecurity, and that actually led to the 35% increase in acute hunger and food insecurity within Somalia. So this is in the context that we know that, of course, there are certain terrorist organizations that are still operating there, like the Al-Shabaab, of course, and the Somalia government has been doing quite a lot to just ensure that they're curbing this with the support of AMISOM. But at the same time, there were natural disasters, like I already mentioned, which were affecting their capacity to respond, to be able to emerge and bounce back from these crises that were affecting them. Now, to make just this situation not sound real for you is that we are also reporting that this is the same year that one of the highest numbers of humanitarian aid workers killed in line of duty happened. In fact, Sudan and South Sudan are among the countries that recorded the highest numbers of humanitarian aid workers being killed. Now, humanitarian aid workers, just for context, I want you to imagine this situation. Your house is burning, and your neighbor comes in and says, look, I want to help you to respond to this particular situation. But when they come, they actually find themselves in a situation whereby they are also part and parcel of the victims to be affected by whatever is happening in your own home. That's exactly what we mean. So 128 humanitarian aid workers were affected this particular year. And affecting, I mean, were killed this year, adding into the global trends of course, not respecting humanitarian laws and not respecting humanitarian aid workers. So this now brings me back to when I started. You're enjoying the end of the year. You're celebrating. And I'm grateful for you. You're able to just, have this moment to merry and celebrate. But this is exactly what happened in 2025. Conflicts, disasters, diseases, climate change, food insecurity, refugee situations. We cannot call this normal. We cannot walk into 2026 still thinking that these are things that should be normal, should be defining Africa as we know it, Mama Africa. Now, I have basically been able to paint for you the picture of what was happening in Africa for the year 2025. And you're talking about all these humanitarian crises. But one thing that I do not want us to lose sight of is that humanitarian crisis is basically a human rights situation. It's a human rights crisis. When governments fail to protect its own citizens, when we have a population being displaced from their homes, when we have drought basically causing food insecurity, when we have schools being closed, health facilities being destroyed, aid workers being affected, this is not just a humanitarian crisis. This is a human rights crisis. We are talking about right to dignity, right to life, basically. These are principles that you and I both know. We're talking about right to food, right to shelter, right to healthcare. And so one of the things that we want to call on governments today and other stakeholders is that as you're planning for a response, as you're planning to curb the humanitarian crisis that we have basically seen across Africa, you have to put human rights context analysis at the heart of any major plans. I've seen a lot of communication from, different international organizations appealing for aid, appealing for response support. But one of the things that we want to be able to talk about is make sure at the heart of any response, especially lasting solutions, is that human rights is at the core. It's not enough to provide aid. It's not enough to provide shelter if we are going to continue seeing blatant violations of rights to life, right to food, right to shelter, right to dignity, right to healthcare, and just peace and stability across this region. Now, it's interesting that at this particular time, one of the things that happened is that civilians were the most affected as a population across Africa with all these things that happened, not even the armies or the armed, insurgencies that were happening. Now, in any particular situations, civilians must never be the cause of any conflict. That is something that you and I need to agree. And if you're a policy maker, if you're a decision maker, or you even live in the house of one, you need to make sure that this communication is given out. Civilians must never be the cause of any conflict. Because across Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, we basically witnessed civilians paying the highest cost of these conflicts in 2025. Now, this is in dire violation of international humanitarian law. The international humanitarian laws that talk about protection of civilians, and they also talk about, for example, starvation must never be used as a weapon. We are talking about civilians must never be the target of any particular conflict. We're also talking about humanitarian assistance should never be obstructed. These are things that are basically existing in international humanitarian law. But as ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, will tell you, this year saw one of the most blatant disregard of international humanitarian law. In fact, there are conversations on whether we should even strengthen it, right? In fact, ICRC says we should even broaden the context in terms of the people that are being protected by international humanitarian law, from civilians. We talk about prisoners of war, shipwrecked soldiers. But this time round, we need to talk about humanitarian aid workers more, because their protection, 128 aid workers killed across Africa just 1 year. That basically tells you how we have total disregard for humanitarian workers. And so for this particular reason, we are calling upon governments, international organizations, the United Nations, that one of the things that needs to happen is that accountability has to be the paramount foundation of conversations. We cannot start this conversation in 2026 if we do not hold people accountable for those that were responsible for attacks on civilians and humanitarian aid workers. One of the other things that we need to be able to ensure that we talk about is we have to strengthen civilian protection mechanisms. We are seeing situations whereby people are being blatantly killed in their homes. They are not combatants. They do not have any weapons with them. Children, for God's sake. Women, the elderly, persons with disabilities. This is totally unacceptable, even as we walk into 2026. And so one of the other things that we are going to call upon the government, and as I'm thinking about this, it's ambitious, but it's possible. Independent monitoring mechanisms. As we speak, we know that the huge responsibilities placed on the country itself to give its own, the universal, peer review mechanisms, reporting to the United Nations. But at the same time, we need to see other independent actors coming into place. International organizations need to be given space to be able to monitor human rights violations, especially attacks on civilians and humanitarian aid workers. This is how we should do it in 2026. Now, one of the things that you and I both know is there are certain sentiments that exist within our context that refugees are a burden. Refugees, on the contrary, are rights holders. And forced displacement should never be criminalized. Forced displacement basically requires protection. I have an interesting scenario where one of my friends told me that their mother gave them one of the most life-changing lessons in life. She said that nobody willingly puts themselves in a vulnerable situation. And this goes back to my own experience and as a refugee, lawyer. One of the things that we have come to realize is that nobody wants to be a refugee. You and I both know that nobody wants to be a refugee. And so we are seeing, in the context, in the pretext of, matters of national security, protecting sovereignty by countries, people blocking and impeding refugee movements across their borders. This is totally wrong, because why would you criminalize someone who is running away from conflicts and situations that will put their lives at risk? Why would you criminalize that? Why would you stop them from moving? So one of the things that we have to think about, international organizations, governments, even the host communities, is that refugees are not a burden. They are right holders, and all they need is protection. Children in that context need protection. Mothers need protection. Women need protection. The elderly need protection. Persons with disabilities need protection. And this is exactly what we are called upon to do. Because if you're my neighbor and I can't come for help from you and I need that help, then why are we neighbors in the first place? Because in Africa, I should be able to come borrow salt from your house, or my child should come and spend a night at your house if things are not okay in my home. That's exactly what we need to scale at the international level. So let's reflect on the Kampala Convention that protects refugees in Africa. Let's reflect on the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Refugees in 1951 that basically protects refugees as well. And these documents have very good precedences and guidelines on how governments and the general population can protect refugees in Africa. Asylum seekers, please, let's not return them. Let's remember that refoulement, returning of refugees or asylum seekers, is a crime in international law. Now, years ago, we talked about climate change will come. I was in school when we were told that, climate change, global warming will be coming. But today, it's not a matter that will be in the future. It's Africa's present reality. And as we speak today, climate change is at the heart of human rights conversations. We know that there are certain climate exacerbated displacements in Africa. And so as we talk about response to humanitarian crises in Africa, one of the things that we need to keep at the center of this particular response is ensuring that, for example, climate justice for Africa. We know that we are the lowest pollutants, but we suffer the highest consequences of climate change in the world. We also need to ensure that climate change and adaptation mitigation measures are actually followed up on. People talking about carbon trading and carbon credits, but exactly who stands to benefit in these conversations? And so this is why it's important that as humanitarian actors are putting together a response plan, a response mechanism for 2026 in Africa, climate change situations have to be put at the core. Analysis of the context, to what extent they affect us, in terms of affecting food security, affecting right to homes, shelters, water, and even just property, for example, like animal and land. These are things that have to be looked into critically as we walk into 2026, because climate change is now at the core of human rights. Now, women and children have continued to bear the heaviest burden of all these humanitarian crises that we've talked about in Africa. And one of the things that I would definitely tell you for a fact is that they are disproportionately affected by this particular, these humanitarian crises. And we are seeing a lot of sexual gender-based violence happening on women and young girls and even boys, unfortunately. We're even having situations whereby children are being recruited as combatants. You can imagine a child soldier being taken in. What exactly have you done to their lives? We also have early marriages in these particular situations. We also have situations whereby education has been disrupted for these particular groups and children. And so as we speak about humanitarian context, let's not forget the people who have been disproportionately affected, women and children and other vulnerable groups in the societies. And so as we think about 2026, let's put gender-based responses. Let's put gender at the center of these conversations. Let's put children's rights and the best interest of the child as propounded in the Convention for the Rights of Children, one of the most elaborate documents that talks about the rights of children. Let's put the best interest first. And interestingly, there can never be for us without us. And so one of the things that we're calling upon African leadership is to put women-led solutions and put women at the center of humanitarian leadership across all sectors, because they are affected. And you and I both know this is where the future generation, the future of Africa lies, in its children, in its women. Now, that has basically been a roundup of what we've seen across Africa in terms of humanitarian crisis. And we have also seen how that has been affecting human rights, which basically is at the core of all of us, because I am a human being. And the fact that I have this particular privilege to be a human being, I have those rights. And so that has been basically the roundup. But the key message for all of us as we celebrate, as we think about the next year, let's remember that we will be focusing on this crisis. But the key message for me to you and to humanitarian actors and to governments and to the United Nations is Africa needs homegrown solutions. But at the same time, there needs to be prioritization of Africa's humanitarian crisis at the global scale. When people meet, when discussions are happening in boardrooms, let's not forget who we are talking for. Let's not forget that woman, that mother. Remember the video that I talked about of that woman who was trying to shield her children in El Fasher in Sudan? That is the person who needs to be at the back of our minds when we are cutting deals in boardrooms. And so we want localization to be a priority. Let the aid come to the people who know exactly where the problem is. And as we're speaking about aid, let's have governments talk about local solutions. It's not enough to keep asking for help. We know that right now priorities are changing. The situation in Gaza is one of the worst ever in history. The situation in Ukraine as we're speaking. So nobody's going to prioritize our problems if we do not prioritize them ourselves. So we need to put more funding, more resources towards humanitarian responses in this country and in Africa, in this continent. And particularly, they say, you and I grew up knowing that prevention is better than cure. So why don't we just have a peaceful, stable Africa? This particular moment reminds me of one of the greatest sons this continent has ever produced, the late Kofi Annan. And Kofi Annan basically had three main things at the core of his work, even as a United Nations Secretary General. 1, peace and stability for Africa. 2, respect for human rights in Africa. And number 3, which is one of the most important ones, is basically functional systems and governments that prioritizes its people and not themselves. This is my call to action to you, in the spirit of what Kofi Annan wanted for us, in the spirit of what independent fighters and our freedom fighters wanted for us. Please, peace and stability. Human rights are the center of what we have, and respect for human life. That is what we need to have in Africa. So that has been our segment this period. And this is basically the first episode. So make sure that you follow us on all our social media, Humanitarian Affairs Africa, on LinkedIn, on X, on Facebook, also on YouTube. Make sure that you like and subscribe. And please also tell me, what crisis do you want me to focus on? Give it a deeper focus and a deeper lens in 2026, because that's exactly what we will be doing. Also tell me, what were the hits and misses that you think that we need to focus on in 2026? Other than that, I wish you happy holidays, and please, let's remember the African child, the African mother, the African woman, and Africa, our motherland. Thank you.